Royal guard locks the doors. After Prince Louis runs into his arms crying, "He did this with me." Birds chirped softly, and the distant sound of the palace clock echoed through the halls. The royal grounds were usually full of children's laughter and the soft murmur of servants attending their duties. But today, there was an unusual stillness that seemed to settle over the estate like a soft blanket. Prince Louis, the youngest member of the royal family, had wandered farther from the usual playground and corridors than he had ever gone before. Usually cheerful and full of energy, Louis now walked with a strange hesitation. His small hands were clenched, and his brows were furrowed, hiding the gentle sparkle in his eyes that everyone adored. No one had expected him to venture into the quieter part of the garden, where tall hedges created winding paths and secluded corners. A royal guard, Thomas, was making his usual rounds. He had served the royal family for many years, and he knew every path, every window, and every secret corner of the palace grounds. Thomas had seen Louis play many times, chasing butterflies, laughing under the fountains, and running after the palace dogs. But today, Thomas noticed something different. From a distance, Thomas saw Louis moving hurriedly, almost as if he were searching for someone or trying to escape. The young prince's steps were uneven and his head hung low. Something was wrong. Thomas quickened his pace, his polished boots crunching against the gravel path, and called out gently, "Louis, are you all right?" Louis didn't answer at first. He continued walking quickly, his little feet carrying him toward a narrow, hidden passageway between the tall hedges. The royal guard felt a wave of concern. Something had clearly upset the prince, and Thomas knew that in moments like this he needed to act fast. He followed carefully but with urgency, keeping a respectful distance so he wouldn't startle the young boy. As Thomas turned the corner, he saw Louis stop abruptly. The prince's small body shook and tears filled his eyes. Before Thomas could reach him, Louis ran straight into his arms, clutching him tightly. The guard could feel the boy trembling and his heart ached at the sight. Louis's usually cheerful face was now clouded with fear and confusion. Through his tears, Louis whispered words that made Thomas stiffen instantly. "He did this with me." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The innocence of the prince made those words even heavier. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomas gently lifted Louis in his arms, careful not to frighten him further. He could feel the boy's heartbeat racing, and he knew that Louis needed safety and comfort immediately. Thomas glanced around. The garden seemed peaceful, almost serene, but Thomas knew better. Danger was often hidden where it was least expected. He carried Louis quickly but carefully toward a small, secure room near the palace's east wing. This room was rarely used, often reserved for emergencies or private meetings. Today, it would become a sanctuary. Once inside, Thomas closed the door quietly but firmly. He turned the key in the lock, ensuring no one could enter uninvited. Louis, still trembling, sank onto a soft chair, his small hands covering his face. Thomas knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Louis, you're safe now," Thomas said softly. His voice was calm, steady, and reassuring. He had been trained for situations like this, but nothing could fully prepare him for the sight of a child so clearly upset and afraid. Louis lifted his head slightly, his big eyes glistening with tears. He did something I don't understand," the boy stammered, his voice quivering. Thomas nodded, understanding that the child was struggling to explain something that had hurt him deeply. He maintained eye contact, showing patience and empathy. "It's okay, Louis. You don't need to explain everything right now. Just tell me what you can, and we'll handle the rest together." The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the palace air conditioning and the distant sound of birds outside. Thomas stayed close to the prince, making sure he felt secure. He adjusted the cushions behind Louis so he could sit comfortably and offered a small cup of water. Louis took it with shaky hands, grateful for the calm presence of someone who could protect him. Gradually, Louis began to speak in fragmented sentences, sharing tiny details about what had happened. He spoke slowly, stopping often to wipe his tears. Every word was heavy with emotion, every pause filled with the uncertainty of a child trying to process something confusing and frightening. Thomas listened carefully, never interrupting, giving Louis the space to express himself without judgment or pressure. The guard could see the fear lingering in Louis's eyes, the way his small hands fidgeted nervously with the edge of the chair. Thomas gently placed a reassuring hand over Louis's, letting him know he was not alone. "I'm here, Louis." "I won't let anything happen to you," he said firmly, his voice steady but filled with warmth. As Louis spoke, Thomas also thought about the steps he needed to take next. The palace had strict protocols for protecting members of the royal family, especially the young prince. He knew that reporting the incident to the appropriate authorities had to be done carefully and discreetly. For now, the most important thing was keeping Louis safe and helping him feel calm. Time seemed to slow in the room. Outside, the palace continued its routines, the footsteps of servants, the faint ringing of bells, and the distant chatter of staff. But inside this small room, it was as if the world had paused, leaving only the prince and his protector in a bubble of safety and care. Slowly, Louis's breathing began to steady. He leaned slightly against Thomas, finding comfort in the steady presence of someone he trusted. The young prince's trust in the royal guard was evident, and Thomas felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever. Protecting a child, especially one as important as Prince Louis, required more than just vigilance. It required compassion, understanding, and unwavering patience. Thomas spoke gently. "You don't have to face this alone, Louis. We will make sure everything is okay. No one will hurt you here." His words were not just promises, they were a commitment to action. Louis nodded faintly, the first sign of relief crossing his tear-streaked face. Outside the locked doors, palace staff began to wonder why Thomas had not returned. Some felt concerned, while others assumed the prince was simply playing. But Thomas knew better. He remained focused on Louis, aware that even a moment's distraction could be risky. Every sound, every shadow outside the door was a reminder of his duty. As the afternoon sun slowly moved across the sky, Thomas and Louis sat quietly, sharing the silence. It was a silence filled with understanding and safety, a brief moment where the prince could begin to recover from whatever had frightened him. Thomas kept watch over him, ready to respond to any need, any question, any fear. And in that quiet room, away from the bustling palace and the curious eyes of the staff, Prince Louis finally felt, just for a moment, that he was truly safe. The young boy clung a little less tightly, his small shoulders relaxing. Thomas, seeing this, allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long process of healing and protection. But it was a start, a critical first step in keeping the prince safe from harm and showing him that he was never alone. Even as the shadows lengthened and the day edged toward evening, the bond between the royal guard and the young prince strengthened. It was a bond built on trust, care, and the unspoken promise that Thomas would always stand between danger and the boy he was sworn to protect. For now, in that small, locked room, the world felt safer, and Prince Louis, trembling yet hopeful, began to believe that he was not alone in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. After ensuring that Prince Louis was safely seated in the quiet, locked room, the royal guard, Thomas felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. The boy's trembling had slowed, but his small frame still shivered as if the fear that had overcome him lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. Thomas knew that calming Louis was only the first step. What had happened to him needed attention, protection, and careful thought. Thomas moved to a nearby cabinet and retrieved a soft blanket. Gently draping it over the prince's shoulders, he tried to create a sense of warmth and security. "There, that's better," Thomas said softly. Louis looked up at him, eyes red from crying, and offered a faint nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Thomas to see that the prince felt a tiny bit safer. "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas added, kneeling beside Louis so they were at eye level. "We'll stay right here until you're ready to talk, or until you feel safe enough to move again." His voice was calm, steady, and full of reassurance. Thomas had seen children recover from frightening moments before, but he knew that for a prince, there were layers of stress and expectation that made fear more complex. Louis took a small, shaky breath and hugged the blanket closer. I didn't know what to do," he murmured. Thomas nodded, understanding completely. The palace could be a confusing place, even for those born into it, and for someone so young, navigating fear alone could feel overwhelming. Thomas sat back on his heels, giving the boy space but remaining close enough to respond if needed. "You did the right thing by coming to me," he said gently. "Sometimes we can't handle everything on our own. It's okay to ask for help, Louis. That's what I'm here for." Louis hesitated, glancing down at his small hands. He fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, unsure how to begin describing the incident that had terrified him. Thomas waited patiently, knowing that forcing words from a frightened child could make the situation worse. Silence, he reminded himself, was often as important as speech in moments like these. Minutes passed slowly. Outside, the palace continued its rhythm, the distant clinking of dishes, quiet footsteps in the halls, and the faint murmur of voices. But inside the locked room, time felt suspended. It was a moment of pause, a bubble of calm in which the young prince could begin to gather himself. Finally, Louis spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't supposed to, I trusted him. His small hands gripped the blanket tighter and his voice shook. Thomas could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between fear, confusion, and the desire to be brave. "It's okay, Louis," Thomas said, his voice firm but gentle. "You trusted someone and it hurt you. That's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." He reached out slowly, placing a hand over Louis to offer comfort. The young prince looked at him, searching for assurance, and Thomas squeezed his hand lightly. Louis's voice trembled as he continued. "I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to stop it. I just ran." His words were halting, filled with emotion, and Thomas felt a deep surge of protectiveness. This child had been through something confusing and frightening, and now he needed a steady hand to guide him through the aftermath. Thomas nodded, keeping his tone calm. "You did exactly what you needed to do. You ran to someone you trust, and that's what counts. You made the right choice, Louis, and now we'll make sure you're safe." The prince's shoulders began to relax slightly, though the tension in his small frame was still visible. Thomas knew it would take time for Louis to fully process what had happened, and he was prepared to be patient. He adjusted the chair slightly so the prince could sit more comfortably, leaning back as if to create a protective cocoon around him. "I promise you, no one is going to hurt you while I'm here," Thomas continued. "We have rules to protect you and we'll follow them. Right now, your job is to be safe and let me take care of everything else." Louis looked up at Thomas, his eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, there was silence again, as if he were deciding whether he could believe the words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. The single word felt heavy with relief, and Thomas felt a small wave of hope. Outside the room, the palace staff began to notice the absence of both the guard and the prince. Whispers spread through the corridors as people speculated about what was happening. But Thomas remained focused, knowing that keeping the room locked and private was the most important step. The world outside could wait. For now, Louis's safety was the priority. Thomas decided to create a comfortable environment for the prince, bringing over a small tray with juice and some biscuits. He set it on a nearby table, keeping a respectful distance, and encouraged Louis to eat something small. The prince hesitated at first, then picked up a biscuit slowly. It was a tiny act, but it signaled that he was beginning to regain a sense of normalcy, even if just a little. As Louis ate, Thomas began thinking carefully about the next steps. Reporting the incident to the palace authorities was necessary, but it had to be done in a way that protected the prince's privacy and emotional well-being. He made a mental note to contact the appropriate officials discreetly once Louis felt a little safer. Meanwhile, the guard's role was simple but critical: provide comfort, stability, and a sense of security. Time continued to pass, and slowly Louis began to open up more. His words were hesitant, filled with pauses and uncertainty, but each sentence revealed more of what had happened. Thomas listened attentively, never interrupting, showing with his silence that he was fully present and ready to help. He offered gentle nods and soft words of reassurance whenever the prince's voice faltered. "You're very brave, Louis," Thomas said softly. "It's not easy to talk about things that scare us, but telling me what happened is the first step toward feeling safe again." Louis's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was a glimmer of trust in them. He leaned slightly against Thomas, seeking comfort in the steady presence of someone who cared. The guard adjusted the blanket around the prince, letting him rest his head on his shoulder for a moment. It was a small gesture, but it conveyed safety, understanding, and unconditional support. The room remained quiet except for the soft sound of the prince's breathing and the occasional rustle of the blanket. Outside, the palace continued its normal routine, but Thomas remained fully attentive, aware that even the slightest distraction could affect the young prince's fragile emotional state. Gradually, Louis began to feel a little more composed. He straightened in his chair and looked up at Thomas with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. Will he be stopped?" the prince asked quietly. His voice was filled with concern, not just for himself, but for the idea that someone could continue to cause harm. Thomas nodded, keeping his tone gentle yet firm. "Yes, Louis, he won't be able to hurt you or anyone else. We'll make sure of that. Right now, you just need to focus on feeling safe. Everything else will be handled." Louis seemed to absorb the words, his small hands slowly relaxing. He picked at the crumbs on the table, a sign that he was beginning to regain a sense of routine and normalcy. Thomas allowed a small smile, encouraging the boy to see that he could still enjoy simple comforts even after a frightening experience. As the afternoon moved closer to evening, Thomas kept up a steady presence. He didn't rush Louis, didn't pressure him to speak more than he was ready to, and didn't allow outside concerns to enter the room. For the prince, this moment of calm, of uninterrupted safety was crucial. In the quiet room, Thomas realized that the young prince was slowly learning that he could trust someone outside of his family to protect him. That trust, once broken by fear and uncertainty, was beginning to rebuild brick by brick with patience, kindness, and unwavering care. Thomas knew that the healing process would take time, but he also knew that the first step had been taken, and that it was perhaps the most important of all. By the time evening light began to filter through the windows, Louis's tears had mostly dried, and his small frame appeared calmer. He still held onto the blanket, a comforting shield, but his posture showed that he was beginning to feel secure in Thomas's presence. The guard, seeing this progress, felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. His duty was not just to protect, but to comfort, and in these moments, he had succeeded in both. The palace outside may have been bustling with its usual routine, but inside the small, locked room, a young prince had found a safe haven, and a devoted guardian had proven that he would stop at nothing to ensure the boy's well-being. Thomas silently vowed that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would remain by Louis's side, ready to shield him from harm, offer comfort when needed, and provide the stability that the young prince so desperately required. And for Louis, the knowledge that he was not alone, that someone cared deeply and would act to protect him, began to plant the first seeds of courage, trust, and hope. For the first time since the frightening incident, he felt a little stronger, a little braver, and a little more certain that he could face the days ahead with the support of someone who truly had his best interests at heart. As the evening sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace walls, the small room where Thomas had brought Prince Louis seemed like a world apart. Outside, the palace continued its routine. Footsteps echoed down marble corridors, servants moved quietly with trays and documents, and distant voices carried through the halls. Yet inside, time seemed to slow. The young prince, still wrapped in the soft blanket Thomas had placed over his shoulders, sat quietly in his chair, trying to make sense of the storm of emotions that had overwhelmed him earlier. Thomas, kneeling beside him, could see the flicker of fear lingering in Louis's eyes. The prince was beginning to speak more freely now, though each word was heavy with hesitation and uncertainty. Thomas encouraged him gently. "It's okay to tell me what happened, Louis. You don't have to be scared. We'll handle everything together." Louis took a deep, shaky breath and began in a small voice. I trusted him," he said, his words barely audible. "He said he wanted to play a game, and then it wasn't like a game." He paused, the weight of his emotions making it hard to continue. Thomas kept his gaze soft and reassuring, letting the prince know that it was safe to speak at his own pace. "Take your time, Louis," Thomas said. "You don't have to finish the story in one go. Just tell me what you feel comfortable sharing." The young prince nodded faintly, his small fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "He said no one would find out, and I didn't know what to do. I felt scared and confused." His voice broke and tears welled up again. Thomas gently handed him a clean handkerchief, allowing him to wipe his eyes. "It's okay to feel scared, Louis," Thomas said softly. "You were brave to come to me. You did the right thing." He reached out to place a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. The warmth of the gesture seemed to anchor Louis slightly, giving him the courage to continue. Louis's small voice trembled as he added, "I didn't want anyone to be mad at me or think I was wrong." The pause that followed was heavy with unspoken feelings of fear and guilt. Thomas knew that children often blamed themselves for situations beyond their control, and he needed to reassure Louis that none of this was his fault. "You are not wrong, Louis," Thomas said firmly. "You did nothing to cause this. None of it is your fault. What matters now is that you are safe, and that's exactly what we will make sure happens." Louis's eyes searched Thomas's face, looking for proof in his calm, steady expression. He seemed to find some comfort there, but his small frame still shook occasionally, reminders of the fear that had overtaken him earlier. Thomas knew that this emotional journey was far from over, but the fact that Louis was beginning to talk was a significant step forward. "Tell me what you remember," Thomas continued gently. "Only the parts you can in your own words. No pressure, Louis." The young prince took a few moments, biting his lower lip and taking deep breaths before speaking again. "He took me to a room, and I thought maybe it was a game, but it was. I wanted to say no, but I was scared. And then I ran until I found you." His words were raw with emotion, and Thomas could feel the depth of the young prince's trauma in every sentence. Thomas nodded, absorbing every word with patience and care. "You did exactly what you needed to do, Louis. You ran to safety. That's what matters." Louis looked at Thomas, eyes wide and filled with both fear and relief. Will he get into trouble?" he asked quietly. The innocence and concern in his voice made Thomas's heart ache. This small boy, who had faced something terrifying, was now worried about consequences and fairness. Thomas smiled gently, keeping his tone firm but comforting. "Yes, Louis. Those who do harm will be held accountable. You don't need to worry about that. Your job is to stay safe, and my job is to protect you." The prince seemed to absorb the words slowly. He shifted slightly in his seat, leaning into the blanket for comfort, but the tremor in his hands had lessened. Thomas could see that Louis was beginning to feel a sense of reassurance. The steady presence of someone who cared and who had control over the situation was starting to give him a sense of security he hadn't felt since the incident. After a few quiet moments, Thomas decided to take a different approach. He began asking gentle, guiding questions, helping Louis organize his thoughts without making him feel pressured. "When this happened," he asked softly, "what did you feel first?" Louis hesitated, thinking carefully. "Scared," he admitted, "and confused. I didn't know why he did it or what I should do. I felt small, like I couldn't stop it." His words were painfully honest, and Thomas nodded, acknowledging the courage it took for a young child to express such feelings. "You were small, Louis," Thomas said calmly. "And it's natural to feel that way when something happens that you don't understand. But being small doesn't mean you're powerless. You ran to safety. You trusted someone you believed in, and that took courage." The prince's small shoulders lifted slightly, a faint sign of relief passing through him. "I just didn't want anyone to be angry or think I was lying," he whispered. Thomas could see the lingering worry in his eyes, the fear that telling the truth might lead to blame. "Louis," Thomas said gently, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, "telling the truth is never wrong. You are being very brave, and anyone who listens will see that. No one will blame you for this." Louis nodded, taking a deep breath. He began to recount more details, small fragments that painted a clearer picture of the incident. Every word was a piece of the puzzle, and Thomas listened with unwavering attention. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, and didn't show any hint of judgment. His role was to support and guide, and he did so with every fiber of his being. As the evening wore on, the prince's emotions began to settle. The combination of Thomas's patience, gentle guidance, and steady presence allowed Louis to feel, for the first time since the incident, that he could process what had happened without panic. He realized that he was not alone, and that someone was willing to take every step to protect him. Thomas could see the beginnings of a shift in the young prince's demeanor. The wide-eyed fear was slowly giving way to cautious trust. Louis's breathing was more even, his small hands less fidgety, and there was a faint sparkle in his eyes that had been absent earlier. The guard's careful nurturing of the situation had created a safe environment, allowing the prince to regain a sense of control over his emotions. "Louis," Thomas said softly, "what you're feeling is normal. Feeling scared, confused, or unsure after something like this is natural, and it doesn't make you weak, it makes you human and brave." Louis looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes. The tears had mostly dried, leaving only faint streaks across his cheeks. Do you think it will happen again?" he asked quietly. His voice was tentative, laced with the remnants of fear. Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, Louis, it will not happen again. You are safe now, and will make sure it stays that way. I will always be here to protect you." His tone was both gentle and resolute, leaving no room for doubt. The prince allowed himself to relax a little more, leaning slightly against the back of the chair. He felt the weight of fear beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of security that Thomas's calm presence provided. For the first time in hours, he felt that he could breathe without panic. As the night approached, Thomas continued to offer comfort and reassurance, maintaining a balance between attention and space. He allowed Louis to speak at his own pace, encouraging him when he wanted to talk and simply sitting silently when he needed quiet. The guard's dedication created a protective cocoon around the prince, allowing him to feel truly safe for the first time since the incident. Eventually, Louis spoke again, his voice steadier now. I think I feel a little better," he admitted. Thomas smiled, feeling a sense of quiet relief. The progress might seem small to others, but in reality it was monumental. The prince had faced his fear, shared his experience, and begun to trust that someone was truly looking out for him. Thomas nodded. "That's good, Louis. You are stronger than you realize, and you've done everything right. We will continue to make sure you feel safe every step of the way." Outside the locked room, the palace had become quieter as the evening settled in. Footsteps were softer, and the distant chatter of staff had dwindled. Inside, Thomas and Louis remained, a small island of calm in the midst of a vast, bustling estate. The bond between them had deepened through shared understanding, trust, and quiet support. As night fell, Thomas gently helped Louis prepare for bed in the small room. He tucked the blanket around the young prince and adjusted the pillows for comfort. "You can rest now, Louis," Thomas said softly. "No one will disturb you. You're safe." The prince, feeling secure, allowed himself to settle into the chair, resting his head against the soft cushions. For the first time since the terrifying incident, he felt a sense of calm and hope. Thomas remained nearby, vigilant and attentive, ready to respond to any need. And in that quiet room, the young prince began to understand something important. Even in moments of fear and uncertainty, there could be safety, protection, and someone who cared deeply enough to stand by his side, unwavering and steadfast. It was a lesson in trust, courage, and the quiet power of being truly cared for. The palace was quiet that night, but inside the small, locked room, a quiet sense of vigilance lingered. Thomas sat near Prince Louis, who was finally resting after the long and emotionally draining day. Though the young prince was calmer than he had been earlier, the guard knew that the events of the afternoon had left a deep mark. Trust, fear, and relief all mingled in the boy's mind, and Thomas understood that his role was far from over. He had to ensure that Louis felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Thomas carefully observed the prince, noting the small signs of lingering tension. The way Louis's fingers twitched occasionally, the slight furrow in his brow, and the way he held the blanket tightly around his shoulders. These were normal reactions for a child who had faced a frightening experience, and Thomas was determined to address them gently and patiently. "You're doing very well, Louis," Thomas said softly, keeping his voice steady. "It's been a difficult day, but you've been very brave." "I'm proud of you." Louis looked up at him, eyes wide and still glistening with the remnants of tears. I feel a little safer now," he admitted. "Because you stayed with me," Thomas nodded. "I promised I would, and I always keep my promises. You can trust me to stay by your side, Louis, no matter what." His words were simple but filled with sincerity, conveying a sense of security that the young prince desperately needed. After a few moments of quiet, Thomas decided it was time to plan the next steps. Protecting Louis in the room was not enough. The palace itself had to be secure, and the proper authorities had to be informed discreetly to handle the situation appropriately. Thomas knew that careful action was essential to ensure the prince's continued safety and well-being. He gently helped Louis to a more comfortable position, adjusting the chair and blanket so that he could rest more easily. "I'm going to make sure everything outside this room is safe, Louis," Thomas said. "You don't need to worry about a thing. I'll handle it all." Louis nodded, trusting the guard implicitly. Even at his young age, he understood that Thomas had the experience and judgment to protect him. The boy leaned back slightly, finally allowing himself to relax as he realized that the immediate danger had passed. Thomas stepped carefully to the door, turning the key slowly so that the lock remained secure but allowing him to listen to the palace beyond. The halls were quiet now, but Thomas knew that once the news of the incident reached the right ears, things would move quickly. He needed to ensure that Louis remained undisturbed during this process. He returned to the prince's side and knelt beside him. "Louis, do you want to talk a little more, or would you like to rest now?" I want to rest," Louis said quietly. His voice was calm, and there was a small, weary smile on his face. "I feel safe with you," Thomas nodded. "Rest, then. Sleep is important. You need to regain your strength, and I'll be right here if you need me." As Louis settled into the chair, Thomas quietly moved around the room, ensuring that everything was prepared for the night. He arranged pillows and blankets, made sure the water and snacks were within reach, and kept the door locked for security. Every detail mattered because the young prince's peace of mind depended on a sense of order and care. Once everything was in place, Thomas sat quietly beside Louis, maintaining a watchful eye. The palace outside continued its routine, but inside the locked room it felt like a sanctuary. Thomas knew that his presence was a shield, not just from potential physical danger but from fear itself. The boy needed to know in every fiber of his being that he was safe, protected, and cared for. As night deepened, Thomas allowed himself to think ahead. The palace authorities would need to be informed in a discreet, careful manner. Every step would need to be planned so that the incident could be addressed properly without causing additional stress or fear for Louis. Thomas understood the importance of swift but thoughtful action. He quietly drafted a plan in his mind. First, ensure that Louis remained calm and rested. Second, inform the head of palace security and the relevant advisors. Third, take any steps necessary to prevent further incidents and protect the young prince fully. It was a methodical approach, and Thomas's experience gave him confidence that it would succeed. Meanwhile, Louis drifted off to sleep in the chair, his small body finally relaxing. Thomas watched him, feeling a mixture of relief and vigilance. The boy's chest rose and fell steadily, and for the first time since the frightening afternoon, Thomas could see traces of peace on his face. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Hours passed quietly. The palace slept, but Thomas remained awake, keeping watch. Occasionally, he adjusted the blanket or the pillows, ensuring that the prince remained comfortable. He listened carefully for any unusual sounds, his senses alert and ready to respond. It was a quiet, tireless vigilance born out of dedication and care. As dawn approached, the first light of morning filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows across the room. Louis stirred slightly, blinking sleepily, and Thomas leaned closer. "Good morning, Louis," he said softly. "Did you sleep well?" Louis nodded slowly. "Yes, I feel better now." His voice was small but steady. The relief Thomas felt at hearing these words was profound. It signaled that the young prince had begun to regain confidence in his safety and that the healing process could continue. Thomas helped Louis stand carefully, supporting him as he stretched and adjusted to the morning light. "Today, we'll make sure everything is safe outside this room, too," Thomas said gently. "And we'll begin taking steps to make sure this never happens again." The prince nodded, trusting Thomas completely. Together they left the small room, stepping cautiously into the palace corridors. Thomas kept his hand lightly on Louis's shoulder, providing reassurance as they moved. The palace staff, unaware of the full details of the previous day, continued with their routines, but Thomas's presence ensured that Louis remained shielded from any unnecessary stress or attention. As they walked, Thomas briefed the relevant palace authorities discreetly. His careful explanations allowed the officials to understand the situation without alarming others. Plans were made to review security, ensure proper supervision, and protect the young prince from any further risk. Every measure was designed to give Louis safety and confidence, allowing him to return to normal life as much as possible. Throughout the morning, Thomas remained close to the prince, guiding him through the palace, providing reassurance and answering questions in a calm, honest manner. Louis asked occasionally about the incident, and Thomas answered patiently, always keeping the explanations simple and comforting. By midday, the palace had implemented additional measures to ensure safety. Security protocols were reviewed, staff were reminded of their responsibilities, and precautions were taken to prevent any similar situations. Thomas remained a steady presence beside Louis, reinforcing the boy's sense of security and trust. During a quiet moment, Thomas knelt beside the prince and said, "Louis, you've been very brave through all of this. I know it's been difficult, but you've handled it with courage and honesty. That's something very special." The young prince looked up at him, a faint smile forming on his face. "Thank you, Thomas," he said. "I feel safe now. I know you're taking care of me." Thomas smiled, his heart filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Always, Louis, that's my promise." In the following days, life at the palace began to return to a more normal rhythm. Louis slowly resumed his routines, playing in the gardens, attending lessons, and spending time with family. Though the memory of the frightening incident remained, the prince's trust in Thomas and the palace's protective measures allowed him to regain confidence and a sense of security. Thomas remained close, a steady and reassuring presence. He continued to check on Louis regularly, offering guidance, comfort, and protection. The bond between the young prince and his guardian deepened, built on trust, care, and shared experience. The palace, too, had learned from the incident. Security measures were strengthened, supervision increased, and protocols reviewed. The goal was clear: ensure that every child in the palace, especially young Louis, could live in safety, free from fear, and confident that they would be protected. As weeks passed, the young prince began to smile more easily, laugh freely, and engage with the world around him with renewed confidence. The events of that day, though frightening, had become a turning point, a reminder of the importance of vigilance, care, and the protective presence of someone who truly cared. Thomas watched Louis play in the gardens one afternoon, the boy's laughter ringing out across the palace grounds. It was a sound that brought relief and pride. The young prince had faced fear, found safety, and begun to heal. And Thomas, standing nearby, knew that his promise had been kept. He had protected the prince, nurtured his trust, and ensured that safety and care would always be part of Louis's life. In that moment, as the sun shone warmly over the palace gardens, Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction. He had fulfilled his duty, not just as a guard, but as a protector, a guide, and a steady presence in a young prince's life. And for Louis, the knowledge that someone would always be there to shield him, support him, and care for him provided a foundation of courage and confidence that would carry him forward for years to come. The palace had faced a challenge, but through vigilance, care, and unwavering dedication, it had ensured the safety of its most precious member. And for Prince Louis, the lesson was clear. Even in moments of fear and uncertainty, there could be safety, trust, and the steady presence of someone who would never let him down.